A 17-year-old girl set out on a hike in the Olympic National Park, but the girl disappeared without a trace. An exhaustive search turned up nothing, and the case fell into a 4-year silence, becoming another tragic local legend. Until one summer afternoon, when rangers inspecting a storm-damaged grove found something hidden deep inside a hollow tree. A discovery that would unravel a horrifying truth the forest had concealed all along. The calls began not with panic, but with mild impatience. It was late July, and Mary Lane expected her daughter, 17-year-old Emma, to have checked in hours earlier. Emma had gone hiking with her youth group in Olympic National Park, a trip she'd been excited about for weeks. She promised her mother she would text once they were back near the ranger station, where cell reception was stronger. But as evening settled across the small town just outside the park, Mary still hadn't heard anything. She tried Emma's phone again, straight to voicemail. She told herself it was nothing. Bad reception. Maybe Emma's battery had died. Still, a knot of unease began to form. By the following morning, irritation had turned into worry. Emma's group leader called first thing, expecting Emma to be back home already. He explained that their last stretch had been a short, well-marked trail that ended near a ranger post. Everyone else from the group had made it back. Everyone except Emma. Mary Lane's voice shook as she called the local sheriff's office. Her daughter wasn't careless. Emma had grown up in the outdoors. She hiked often, sometimes with her father, who had passed away the year before. She knew how to keep to the trails. She wasn't the type to run away, and she certainly wouldn't vanish without letting her mother know where she was. The first officers to respond treated it as a missing hiker case. Rangers began the preliminary steps of retracing Emma's last known movements. Witnesses from her group reported that Emma had been cheerful, walking at the front of the line with 2 friends. When she decided to go on ahead for the final half-mile of trail, she told them she'd meet them by the ranger station. But when the others arrived, Emma wasn't there. Her friends assumed at first she had already made it back to the parking lot. But her car, still sitting neatly in its spot, told a different story. That car became the first ominous clue. Emma's hiking pack was missing, but inside the vehicle sat her overnight bag, a jacket, and her favorite notebook, items she never went anywhere without. The trail she had walked was among the safest in Olympic, a broad, scenic path shaded by towering firs and moss-draped maples. Tourists visited it every day. It wasn't the kind of wilderness where people simply vanished. By that evening, a command post was set up at the trailhead. Search and rescue teams fanned out in every direction. Helicopters circled overhead. Bloodhounds were brought in, straining at their leashes, noses low to the ground. For a brief moment, there was hope. The dogs picked up a trail leading away from the path toward a grove of ancient cedar trees. But less than a mile in, the scent dissipated. It was as though Emma had walked into the forest and dissolved into the shadows. Investigators worked quickly to piece together a picture of who Emma was, because understanding the person is often as important as understanding the environment. She was 17, bright, responsible, and deeply loved. Teachers described her as determined. Friends remembered her as adventurous, the one who convinced them to climb higher on the rocks or explore a side trail. But she wasn't reckless. She carried water, snacks, and a whistle, habits her father had drilled into her since she was a child. Emma's home life was stable, though scarred by grief. Her father had died of cancer 2 years earlier, leaving her mother and older brother to hold the family together. Hiking had become Emma's way of staying close to her father's memory. Every trail was a reminder of the times they had spent together, of the way he taught her to read maps and respect. The forest. She didn't see hiking as danger. She saw it as comfort. The day she vanished was supposed to be simple. Clear skies, mild temperatures, and a group of familiar faces. Nothing about the morning suggested danger. Which is why, for her mother, the silence that night felt so wrong. Emma would never leave her waiting. By the third day, the search was massive. Rangers, volunteers, state police, and even Coast Guard helicopters joined in. They searched ravines, riverbanks, and ridges, pushing deeper into the backcountry with every passing hour. The only trace of her came late on the fourth day. A ranger, combing the banks of a stream, found Emma's trail map lodged under a stone. The paper was damp, but intact, marked with faint folds and penciled notes in Emma's handwriting. Nearby, her reusable water bottle lay half buried in moss. At first, investigators thought it might be good news. Maybe she had wandered off, lost her way, and would be found nearby. But the dogs brought to the site grew restless. They caught her scent, followed it up a rise toward the grove of cedars, and then stopped again. The forest gave nothing more. No footprints. No scraps of clothing. No sign of a struggle. Reporters descended on the small town, cameras flashing as neighbors gathered outside the ranger station. The story of the missing girl spread quickly. Olympic National Park, with its misty valleys and primeval trees, became the backdrop for nightly news segments across the region. Mary Lane stayed near the command post every day, her face pale and sleepless. She repeated the same words to every reporter who asked, "Emma knows these trails. She would never just disappear." As hours turned into days, the search widened. Teams hiked dozens of miles into the park, some staying overnight in makeshift camps. The helicopters scanned from above, but the dense canopy of trees turned the ground below into a solid roof of green. A person could be standing 30 feet away and remain invisible. Still, they pressed on. But as the second week closed with no sign of Emma, a darker reality began to settle over the investigation. She hadn't simply lost her way. Something else had happened. The disappearance of Emma Lane became the largest search and rescue operation Olympic National Park had seen in years. By the morning of the fifth day, the trailhead where she was last seen had transformed into a command center. Park rangers, county deputies, volunteers, and federal officers crowded around maps pinned to temporary boards, tracing lines of where teams had gone and where they would push next. The first strategy was saturation. From Emma's last known point, search teams fanned out in widening circles. They scoured the popular hiking routes, shouting her name, blowing whistles, leaving markers along the path. But the terrain worked against them. Olympic National Park was vast. Over 900,000 acres of wilderness where rainforest valleys collided with jagged ridges and glaciers. In some places, the canopy was so thick it turned day into twilight. Moss-draped trees rose like pillars. There, roots tangling into caves and hollows where even trained eyes could miss a clue. Streams cut deep ravines into the landscape, their slippery rocks a trap for anyone who fell. Helicopters hovered overhead, but the dense greenery swallowed any chance of spotting a person. Thermal imaging was tested, but the thick forest floor absorbed heat, blending human signatures into the earth itself. From the sky, the entire valley looked like a single living carpet. On the ground, canine units strained at their leashes. The scent trail that had once led near the cedar grove was rechecked again and again. Each time, the dogs lost it at the same spot, spinning in circles, confused. Handlers explained to the family that wind, water, or even deliberate masking could erase a trail. To Mary Lane, that explanation felt hollow. Emma's mother set up a chair near the command center, refusing to leave. Each time a ranger returned from the field, she searched their faces for signs of hope. Each time, the answer was the same. Nothing. No footprints, no dropped food wrappers, no sign of torn clothing. But behind the scenes, investigators were learning how much can be hidden in a place like the Olympics. Rangers described cases where hikers had lain just yards off a trail, invisible beneath ferns. In this environment, a single wrong step could erase a person. The days turned structured but desperate. Teams were assigned grids, marked by coordinates on GPS units. They battled steep slopes, rain that turned soil to sludge and vegetation that clung like claws to their clothes. Volunteers carried long poles to probe through brush, hoping to uncover something, anything that had been overlooked. And yet, despite the intensity, the results were eerily empty. To keep morale up, searchers gathered each evening for briefings. A chalkboard listed areas covered and areas still pending. The map became a spiderweb of red marker lines, circling farther and farther from the trailhead. But each new day ended the same. No Emma. The sheriff's department tried to reassure the Lane family. Missing hikers had been found before, sometimes after weeks in the wilderness. Survivors had clung to rivers, eaten berries, and endured storms. The human body could be resilient. But with each nightfall, the odds diminished. What puzzled investigators most was the lack of secondary clues. Experienced hikers who go missing usually leave traces: a broken branch, a scrap of fabric, a fire ring. Emma had been carrying a pack, water, and a whistle. None of it appeared. Only her map and water bottle, discovered by the stream, pointed to her presence. But why would she abandon them? Mary and her son David replayed every conversation they'd had with her. Emma wasn't careless. She wasn't impulsive. And she wasn't naive about the risks of the wilderness. David remembered how she used to tease him for not tying his boots properly, how she always double-checked the compass when they hiked together. To imagine her simply walking off and vanishing made no sense. By the end of the second week, the investigation expanded. Detectives interviewed Emma's friends and teachers, scouring for hints of whether she might have chosen to disappear. But nothing suggested she had run away. She had been making plans for college, filling out applications, and working weekends at a coffee shop. She had no reason to leave, and every reason to come home. The pressure mounted. Local news anchors reported from outside the park gates, their voices solemn as they spoke of the girl lost in the woods. National outlets picked up the story, running segments on the dangers of hiking and the vastness of Olympic National Park. The coverage drew more volunteers. Some drove hundreds of miles to help. They brought drones, radios, and even specialized search equipment. Still, the forest gave nothing back. Among the searchers, a superstition began to form. Some whispered that the cedars where Emma's scent had been lost were cursed, that the trees themselves held her. Rangers dismissed such talk, but it grew among the volunteers, adding a layer of unease to each day's search. By the third week, the official tone shifted. The sheriff announced that while the search would continue, it was now considered a recovery mission, not a rescue. To the Lane family, that word, recovery, landed like a blow. Mary refused to accept it. She told anyone who would listen that her daughter was alive, that she was out there waiting to be found. David quietly stood beside her, though even he admitted privately that the silence was beginning to feel final. Investigators cataloged every lead. Some hikers reported hearing a whistle in the distance. Others swore they saw a girl moving through the trees at dusk, but each tip dissolved when checked. Shadows, echoes, imagination. What the investigators didn't dismiss, however, was the possibility of another presence in the forest. The area had seen occasional reports of squatters, people living illegally in cabins or makeshift shelters deep in the woods. Rangers also knew of seasonal workers who drifted in and out of the park, some with checkered pasts. It was a theory no one wanted to speak aloud to the family, but among the investigators, the possibility of abduction lingered. As the fourth week ended, the command center began to shrink. Volunteers returned to their lives. The media presence waned. Even some rangers admitted privately that the trail had gone cold. But for Mary Lane, the search never ended. She kept returning to the trailhead, sitting in her chair, waiting for the miracle call. Waiting for the moment someone would step out of the woods and say they had found her daughter. By the fifth week, the momentum of the search began to fragment. What had started as a coordinated operation now felt like 1,000 unanswered questions. Scattered across the wilderness, the Lane family clung to hope, but investigators knew the timeline was unforgiving. In survival cases, the window for finding someone alive shrinks dramatically after the first few days. By a month, unless the person has shelter and supplies, chances of survival are slim. But Emma's disappearance defied those calculations. There was no body, no clothing, no sign of scavenging animals. It was as though she had stepped off the trail and been swallowed by the forest. The lack of physical evidence left investigators leaning on theories. And in a case like this, theories multiplied like shadows. The first theory was the simplest: accident. Emma may have wandered off trail, fallen into a ravine, or slipped near one of the many fast-moving streams. In Olympic National Park, a body could lie just yards away, concealed by ferns, moss, or fallen logs. Entire deer carcasses had been known to vanish into undergrowth, never to be seen again. Rangers explained this to Mary, but she shook her head. Emma wouldn't have wandered. She knows better. The second theory was more sinister: animal attack. Cougars roamed the park, as did black bears. In rare cases, both had attacked humans. But here again, there were holes. Predatory attacks leave traces: blood, drag marks, disturbed ground. None had been found. And Emma, with her whistle and group training, would have had at least a chance to scare an animal away. The silence of the forest argued against this explanation. As weeks stretched on, a third theory took shape, one investigators were reluctant to voice publicly: abduction. Olympic, for all its beauty, also attracted drifters, seasonal workers, and in some cases, people seeking to vanish themselves. Rangers had stumbled upon illegal camps deep in the woods, complete with makeshift shelters and signs of long-term living. What if Emma had crossed paths with someone who didn't want to be found? This idea gained weight when searchers stumbled across a fire ring in a remote section of forest several miles from the cedar grove. Around it lay food wrappers, cigarette butts, and an old tarp. The items were too weathered to prove recent use, but they confirmed what investigators already suspected. Others moved unseen in the park. The discovery made headlines. Reporters latched onto the hidden camps theory, fueling speculation that Emma had been taken. Some outlets sensationalized it further, connecting her disappearance to other unsolved vanishings across Washington. Soon, conspiracy threads online tied her case to everything from serial predators to cult activity in the Pacific Northwest. But on the ground, none of those stories gave investigators hard leads. The cigarette butts yielded no DNA. The tarp carried no fingerprints. For every promising find, the result was the same: dead end. Even so, the abduction theory lingered. The dogs losing her scent near the cedar grove hinted at human interference. A person could have masked the trail, carried her, or forced her onto a route dogs couldn't track. It was a chilling possibility, one investigators began to consider more seriously as the weeks bled into months. Meanwhile, other theories bubbled up from the public. Some locals whispered of Emma running away. She was 17. Maybe she had left to escape grief over her father's death or pressures at home. But investigators dismissed this quickly. Emma left her wallet, ID, and cherished notebook in the car. She hadn't withdrawn money, and her phone went dark that same evening. People who run away usually leave breadcrumbs. Emma had left none. Mary Lane rejected the idea outright. "My daughter didn't run away," she told reporters, her voice cracking. "She loved her life. She loved her family. Something happened to her in those woods." For a brief time, attention shifted to the youth group she had been with. Could someone in the group have followed her when she went ahead? Could an argument have turned into something more? Detectives quietly questioned each teenager and leader. But the accounts matched. Emma had walked on alone, cheerful, promising to meet them at the ranger station. No tension, no conflict, nothing sinister. Still, the absence of answers created space for doubt. Online forums dissected every detail, some blaming the group leader for not keeping everyone together, others suggesting Emma had been lured off trail by a stranger. None of it could be proven. As the search dwindled into autumn, the forest began reclaiming its silence. Grass grew over footprints. Rains washed away the faintest trails. What remained were fragments: a map, a bottle, a mother's aching memory of the last text she had received from her daughter. "I'll be home tonight." Detectives tried new angles. They pulled surveillance from nearby roads, searching for vehicles that might have entered or exited the park the day Emma disappeared. They flagged 2 vans and a pickup, but the owners were tracked and cleared. They combed through missing persons bulletins, looking for patterns. None aligned perfectly with Emma's case. In desperation, they turned to experts. Survival specialists reviewed the maps. Criminal profilers examined the case notes. Each offered possibilities, but no certainties. Emma's vanishing remained suspended between accident and crime, nature and human. For the Lane family, the theories were both torment and lifeline. Each one meant Emma's fate could still be understood, still be explained. But each dead end deepened their despair. David Lane, Emma's brother, later said those months were like living in a storm that never broke. Every day, we waited for the phone to ring. Every time it rang, our hearts stopped. And every time it wasn't news about Emma, it was like losing her all over again. By winter, the case had slipped into limbo. The sheriff's department scaled back the official search, leaving only periodic patrols. Volunteers dwindled. News coverage waned. But the theories never stopped. In town, in online forums, in the quiet of Emma's home, they kept circling. Each one plausible. Each one incomplete. And beneath them all, one fact remained. Emma Lane had vanished without a trace. And until someone uncovered what the forest was hiding, her story would remain an open wound. By late autumn, the official search effort had thinned to a skeleton crew. The command post at the trailhead, once buzzing with volunteers and reporters, stood quiet. The maps pinned to plywood walls were rolled up and boxed away. The chalkboard filled with search grids and red marker lines was wiped clean. What had once been the center of a desperate, coordinated mission now felt like a place abandoned, as though the forest itself had swallowed not just Emma Lane, but the very energy to find her. The sheriff's office made the announcement in measured tones. The active search was being scaled back. Resources had been exhausted, terrain combed multiple times, and no further evidence had surfaced. Officially, the case would remain open. Unofficially, it was cold. For the Lane family, those words were unbearable. Mary had stood by the ranger station for weeks, clutching her daughter's photo, waiting for news. She couldn't comprehend how so many people could search so thoroughly and still find nothing. She continued to drive to the park almost daily, bringing fresh posters, taping them at trailheads, leaving them under windshield wipers of hikers' cars. Missing, Emma Lane, age 17, last seen in July. Her handwriting scrawled notes on the edges. Please help us find her. Her son David accompanied her when he could, though the strain was visible in his face. He had dropped out of classes that semester, telling friends he couldn't sit in lecture halls while his sister was somewhere out there, lost. But the world moved on. The media coverage faded after the first snow. News crews turned their cameras elsewhere. Online forums that had once buzzed with theories began to quiet, overtaken by newer mysteries. Emma's name lingered in occasional posts, but without new evidence, interest waned. Still, in the small town surrounding Olympic, Emma's disappearance didn't vanish so easily. It became a story locals told visitors. The girl who went into the cedars and never came back. Hikers whispered about it on the trail, lowering their voices when they passed the grove where her scent had last been traced. Campers told the story around fires, each time adding new twists, that she had been taken by a recluse, that her ghost roamed the trails at dusk, that the forest itself had claimed her. To investigators, these legends were frustrating, but they knew they couldn't stop them. When a case goes unsolved, myth fills the gaps left by evidence. In the sheriff's office, the file on Emma Lane thickened with notes but thinned with activity. Detectives reviewed tips when they came in, but most were false leads. A reported sighting in Oregon turned out to be a runaway mistaken for Emma. A set of bones found by hunters belonged to a deer. Each time, Mary's hopes spiked, only to crash again. By the first anniversary of her disappearance, Emma's case had become one of those quiet tragedies that hover unsolved in police archives. Families mocked the dates with candles and vigils. Communities remembered. But the momentum of the investigation slowed to a crawl. Mary refused to accept it. She organized yearly gatherings at the park gates, where supporters held signs and distributed flyers to hikers. She spoke to anyone who would listen, appearing on regional radio shows, insisting her daughter's story not be forgotten. "Emma is still out there. Somebody knows something. Please, please don't let her vanish twice." Her grief carried a different weight than resignation. It was the weight of a mother demanding the world to keep looking. David grew quieter. He rarely spoke publicly, but friends noticed how he avoided wooded areas, how he flinched when someone mentioned camping or trails. The forest, once a place of comfort for the Lane family, had become a wound. Among investigators, the case drifted into background noise. Every few months, a detective would revisit the file, reread reports, recheck evidence logs. But with no new clues, the case felt stuck in time. And yet, the silence was deceptive. Because in the forest, time never stops. The rains came, swelling. Rivers. Moss crept over fallen logs. Roots deepened, covering whatever lay beneath. The wilderness didn't pause for grief. It simply went on, erasing human traces one season at a time. Emma's name lingered like an echo. It appeared on missing person databases, in the corners of internet boards, in the hearts of a family that refused to let go. But for 4 long years, nothing changed. The girl who had set out on a bright summer hike had become another tragic legend of Olympic National Park, another name added to the list of those who vanished in its endless wilderness. Until the day the forest itself betrayed its secret. By the summer of the 4th year, Emma Lane's name had nearly slipped from public memory. Her posters, once stapled to every telephone pole in town, had faded in the rain and sun until the paper curled and the ink ran. The trailhead where she was last seen no longer carried daily searchers or news crews. Hikers passed by without even knowing the place had once been the epicenter of one of Washington's most haunting mysteries. But her mother never forgot. Each year, Mary Lane lit candles in front of the ranger station. Each year, she pressed the sheriff's office for updates, though she knew the answer before she asked. Nothing new, no leads, no trace. It seemed the forest had swallowed Emma whole. And then, in August, a violent summer storm swept across Olympic National Park. Winds tore through valleys, uprooting trees that had stood for centuries. When the skies cleared, rangers were dispatched to assess damage along popular trails, removing hazards before visitors returned. One of those rangers, a veteran named Daniel Brooks, had walked those paths for over 20 years. He knew every curve of the trail, every grove of cedar and fir. On that morning, his assignment was simple: survey a section near the grove where Emma's scent had last been tracked 4 years earlier. The storm had left the ground littered with branches and bark, and several massive trunks had toppled, their roots yawning like open mouths from the soil. Brooks moved slowly, making notes, marking hazards with bright tape. That's when he saw it. An old cedar, hollow at its base, had split under the storm. The trunk had cracked open like a wound, exposing the inner cavity. Inside, tangled in a mat of moss and roots, was something that made Brooks stop cold. A pair of shoes. They were laced neatly, toes pointed downward as though they had been placed, not discarded. The fabric was darkened by time and dampness, but still recognizable. And Brooks remembered. He remembered the description that had been circulated for months after Emma vanished. Black hiking shoes with a faint pink stripe along the sole. For a long moment, the ranger stood frozen, listening to the silence of the forest. Then he pulled out his radio, his voice breaking as he called it in. Within hours, the site was swarming with officials. Crime scene tape ringed the hollow tree. Forensic specialists crouched in the moss, photographing every angle before carefully extracting the shoes. As they pulled back layers of damp growth, other fragments appeared, thin scraps of fabric clinging to the inner bark, and deep inside, brittle shards that were unmistakably bone. At first, some wanted to believe it was a coincidence. Maybe the shoes had been left by another hiker. Maybe the storm had shifted debris. But the more they looked, the clearer it became. This was no accident of nature. The shoes weren't scattered. They were wedged. The moss inside the cavity wasn't random growth. It had been stuffed there, packed in deliberately, as though someone had tried to conceal what lay within. the discovery spread through the park like wildfire. Rangers, who had searched for Emma years earlier, gathered at the site, staring into the hollow trunk in disbelief. For them, it was like the forest had finally given up a secret it had guarded for too long. The remains were carefully collected and transported under guard. At the lab, preliminary DNA confirmed what everyone already suspected. They belonged to Emma Lane. For her mother, the news was shattering and clarifying at once. The girl she had begged the world to keep looking for had finally been found. Not alive, but not lost anymore. But the details of the discovery raised darker questions than it answered. Forensic teams examined the hollow trunk with precision. They noted gouges in the wood, sharp, intentional cuts made by a blade. It appeared someone had widened the natural cavity, carving space to force the shoes and remains inside. The moss, too, bore human interference. It wasn't just growth. It had been shoved deep into the cavity like insulation, sealing the evidence away. And there was more. Soil samples taken from inside the trunk carried traces of chemicals that had no natural place in the forest. Faint residues of diesel fuel and nitrates common in agricultural fertilizer. Whoever had hidden Emma there hadn't just stumbled across the hollow by chance. They had used materials from outside the park, suggesting someone with knowledge of forestry or farming. The implications were chilling. Emma hadn't simply fallen into the tree or sought shelter inside. She had been placed there, concealed, hidden with intent. The story broke across regional news within days. Missing girl found in hollow tree after 4 years. The headlines carried an almost surreal quality. Reporters filmed from outside the park gates, gesturing toward the endless forest behind them as though the trees themselves held the answers. Commentators asked the same questions investigators now faced. Who would do this? And why? The Lane family was shielded from cameras, but Mary issued a brief statement through the sheriff's office. Her voice, though trembling, carried a strength reporters hadn't expected. Emma deserved to be found. Whoever did this thought they could hide her forever, but the forest gave her back. Behind the scenes, the investigation shifted gears. Overnight, detectives who had filed Emma's case under cold returned to it with new urgency. The shoes, the moss, the cuts in the wood, every detail hinted at human involvement. No longer a mystery of the wilderness, it was now officially treated as homicide. Experts were called in to analyze the tree itself. Botanists measured the growth of moss and fungi, estimating how long they had been disturbed. They concluded the concealment had occurred not long after Emma disappeared, within days or weeks, not years. That meant whoever had hidden her there likely lived or worked nearby, someone familiar with the area, someone who had reason to believe the tree would remain undisturbed. Detectives pulled old ranger logs, forestry service records, and employment rosters. Anyone who had worked in that sector of the park during the summer of Emma's disappearance was re-examined. And yet, even as the evidence mounted, the horror of the discovery overshadowed everything else. Hikers whispered nervously about the hollow tree. Parents who once took their children camping in Olympic began to hesitate, uneasy at the thought of what secrets the forest might still conceal. For Mary Lane, closure was tangled with renewed anguish. She had begged for her daughter to be found, but nothing could have prepared her for the image of those shoes in the hollow trunk. For 4 years, she had imagined Emma lost, wandering, waiting. To know she had been there all along, hidden in the very place they had searched, was almost unbearable. Detectives promised her they would not stop until they uncovered truth. But in private, they admitted the hardest part was still ahead. Finding a body was one thing. Finding the person who had put it there was another. The hollow tree had given Emma back, but it had also whispered a terrifying message. Someone out there had gone to great lengths to keep her hidden. And if they had done it once, had they done it before? The hollow cedar had given investigators a breakthrough, but the discovery was only the beginning. What came next was the painstaking work of turning fragments into answers. The slow unraveling of what had happened to Emma Lane after she vanished from the trail 4 years earlier. The remains and the shoes were transported under heavy guard to the Washington State Crime Lab. Specialists there began the grim process of examination. The shoes were tagged, photographed, and measured, every stitch documented. For all the years that had passed, they were remarkably well preserved. Moisture and moss had stained the fabric, but the laces were still intact, knotted carefully, as though they had been tied by Emma herself before her final steps. Forensic analysts noted immediately that the condition of the shoes didn't align with the official search theories of accident or animal attack. If Emma had been wandering for days before her death, the soles would have shown heavy wear, the fabric frayed from scrambling over rocks and roots. If she had been attacked by an animal, claw marks or tearing would be evident. But the shoes told a different story. Minimal scuffing, no tearing, and placement too deliberate to suggest chance. Then came the bones. The fragments recovered from inside the hollow were fragile, but still held enough integrity to yield answers. DNA confirmed them as Emma's, ending any final doubts. But the condition of the bones raised new questions. There were no obvious fractures, no gunshot wounds, no signs of violent blunt force trauma. Yet the absence of violence didn't mean the absence of crime. Pathologists turned to the bark. The inner cavity of the cedar had been scraped and gouged. Under microscopic analysis, the cuts were clean, angled, and consistent with a steel blade. Someone had deliberately carved into the tree to widen the cavity, making room to force a body inside. The moss samples told an equally chilling story. Botanists studying the fibers noted that the moss had been compressed unnaturally deep into the hollow, shoved in with force rather than growing there. On its own, lab tests revealed soil particles mixed into the moss that didn't match the surrounding grove. They were traced to a different section of the park, several miles away. That meant whoever had hidden Emma had carried material from outside the site, further proof of deliberate concealment. But the most disturbing revelation came from the chemical analysis. Soil scraped from the cavity and fibers from Emma's clothing both contained residues of diesel fuel and ammonium nitrate, chemicals commonly associated with forestry equipment and fertilizers. These were not substances Emma would have encountered on her hike. Their presence inside the tree suggested someone with access to industrial or agricultural supplies had been involved. Investigators now had a profile beginning to form. The concealment hadn't been the desperate act of a panicked stranger. It had been calculated, methodical, and precise. Whoever did this knew the forest, knew the cedar grove, and had the tools and materials to alter the landscape itself. The findings shifted the case irreversibly from tragedy of nature to homicide investigation. Detectives re-examined every interview from 2015. They flagged individuals with connections to forestry, logging, and seasonal park work. They cross-referenced employment records from that summer. The storm-damaged grove wasn't far from service. Roads used by forestry crews. Could someone who worked in the park itself have been responsible? As the science unfolded, the emotional weight of the discovery deepened for the Lane family. Mary met with investigators privately, learning in halting detail what the lab had found. She listened as they explained the blade marks in the wood, the stuffed moss, the foreign chemicals. She clutched the tissue, her knuckles white, whispering, over and over, "They put her there. Someone put her there." Investigators assured her they were closing in. But, privately, they admitted to each other how difficult this would be. 4 years had passed. Whoever had done this had lived with their secret all that time. They might have moved on, blended back into ordinary life. Without clear forensic evidence pointing directly to a suspect, it would be like trying to catch a ghost. Still, the tree itself offered one more clue. In one of the gouges carved into the inner bark, technicians recovered a sliver of metal. Barely visible to the naked eye, it had lodged in the wood years earlier, preserved by the cedar sap. Under analysis, it was identified as a shaving from a chisel or heavy-duty knife blade. The specific alloy was uncommon, used in forestry and logging tools, but not in standard pocket knives. That detail narrowed the suspect pool further. To build their case, investigators mapped the discovery against the park's work history. They requested rosters of seasonal employees from the summer Emma vanished. Dozens of names appeared. Rangers, trail maintenance workers, forestry contractors. Most had since moved on, some leaving the state, others still living quietly in nearby towns. Detectives began knocking on doors, interviewing anyone who had worked within 10 miles of the cedar grove that summer. They asked about routines, memories, tools. Most cooperated, offering alibis or vague recollections of long days cutting brush, hauling equipment, and repairing trails. But among the interviews, one name caught attention. A man in his 40s who had quit his seasonal contract abruptly, just weeks after Emma vanished. His supervisor at the time remembered it clearly. He had walked off the job mid-season, complaining about the pressure of all the search teams in the woods. His absence hadn't seemed suspicious at the time, just another drifter unwilling to tolerate government oversight. But now, in light of the forensic findings, his name carried a heavier weight. The forensic revelations gave investigators the justification to shift their focus from the unknown wilderness to the very real possibility of a predator hidden among those who knew the park best. For the first time in 4 years, the case felt alive again, but with life came dread. Because if Emma Lane had been hidden in a tree so carefully, so deliberately, investigators feared she wasn't the predator's only victim. The cedar tree had given investigators a direction, and the lab confirmed it. Whoever hid Emma Lane knew the forest intimately, had access to heavy tools, and carried with them substances not native to the park. That profile alone narrowed the possibilities. The sheriff's department, working with state and federal investigators, drew up a list of every individual who had worked in Olympic National Park during the summer of 2015. Seasonal trail crews, forestry contractors, maintenance staff, even temporary hires brought in for invasive species control. All were added to the roster. The names filled several pages. Most were students or outdoors enthusiasts who had long since moved on. But detectives needed to know if one of those names hid a predator. As they went down the list, one stood out: Eli Mercer. He had been hired in May 2015 as part of a small trail maintenance crew assigned to the very sector where Emma's scent had been lost. His job was routine: clearing brush, repairing steps, and removing hazard trees. At the time, he was 42, a wiry man with decades of odd jobs on his resume: logging, construction, seasonal firefighting. Nothing that suggested stability. He had no spouse, no children, and lived alone in a cabin at the edge of the park. What made him stand out was his exit. While most seasonal workers finished their contracts in September, Eli had walked off the job abruptly just weeks after Emma vanished. His supervisor recalled that he had grown tense during the height of the search, complaining that rangers were all over his sector, asking too many questions. He muttered once that the girl was probably already gone, and that the search was a waste of time. At the time, those words were written off as bitterness from a solitary man who didn't like scrutiny. 4 years later, they read differently. Detectives began to dig. They requested his personnel file. It was thin: a short application, references that were never thoroughly checked, and a note about his departure. No one had thought to look deeper then. But now, with Emma's remains recovered, investigators had reason to question every gap in his history. Background checks revealed a string of minor offenses: trespassing on logging land, a bar fight in Forks that ended with broken glass and a hospital bill. Nothing that screamed predator, but a pattern of volatility. More troubling were his residences. He had moved frequently, renting cabins, staying in trailers, always near forests or logging sites. He seemed to orbit the wilderness, never straying far from tree lines. Detectives also spoke with locals. In town, Eli was known, if not well liked. Shopkeepers remembered him buying supplies: fuel, rope, heavy tarps. A neighbor near his cabin recalled late-night hammering, lights flickering in his shed long past midnight. A hunter reported seeing him carrying tools deep into the woods, alone, muttering as he walked. No single account was damning, but together they painted a portrait of an isolated man whose life revolved around the very environment that had swallowed Emma. Investigators obtained a warrant to search public records further. They traced his purchases from local supply stores. There it was again: rolls of industrial-grade black tarp, diesel in small containers, fertilizer. The same substances identified in the soil around Emma's remains. The match was circumstantial, but chilling. The more they looked, the more Eli fit the profile suggested by the forensic revelations. A man with forestry knowledge, access to heavy tools, and the solitude to act unnoticed. A man who had been in the precise place Emma vanished, and who had walked away when the search for her grew too close. But suspicion alone was not enough. Investigators needed to know if Emma had ever crossed paths with him. They re-interviewed Emma's hiking group. None remembered seeing a trail crew worker the day she disappeared. But one friend mentioned something investigators had overlooked. A week before the hike, Emma had joked about a weird guy she saw near the ranger station, standing by a truck, staring at her group. She had brushed it off, but her words were remembered. Could it have been Eli? Detectives compared schedules. On the day Emma disappeared, Eli's crew had been assigned to clear debris less than 2 miles from the cedar grove. He signed in that morning, but there was no record of his movements after noon. No one could confirm if he was still working when Emma left her group and walked ahead. The pieces were aligning. To the Lane family, investigators revealed none of this at first. They had learned hard lessons of premature hope. But quietly, the sheriff's department began preparing. Surveillance was placed on Eli's property. Detectives photographed his comings and goings, his shed, his truck. They noted the rusting equipment scattered in his yard: saws, blades, chisels, tools that could have left the gouges inside the cedar. Neighbors reported he kept mostly to himself, rarely visiting town, never entertaining guests. When spoken to, he was curt, sometimes hostile. One described him as having the eyes of a man always listening to something nobody else can hear. The FBI profiler brought onto the case described men like Eli in stark terms: solitary predators who embed themselves in environments where isolation is normal, whose routines camouflage the abnormal. They don't need to stand out to be dangerous. They thrive by blending into the silence. By the end of that fall, Eli Mercer had shifted from a name on a roster to the prime suspect in Emma Lane's murder. But suspicion is not conviction. Investigators needed a break, a trace, a fragment, something to tie him to Emma definitively. Without it, all they had was the shape of guilt outlined in shadows. The cedar tree had given them their first truth. Now they would need to see if Eli's life concealed the rest. By the time investigators narrowed in on Eli Mercer, they knew the margin for error was razor thin. 4 years had passed since Emma Lane vanished, and if Mercer was responsible, he'd had ample time to bury his secrets deep. If they moved too soon, they risked tipping him off, pushing him into silence or even flight. But if they waited too long, evidence could decay further, slipping into the soil like everything else the forest consumed. Surveillance teams spent weeks watching his cabin. It sat at the edge of the park, down a rutted gravel road few outsiders ever traveled. The cabin itself leaned with age, its cedar siding gone gray, the roof patched with mismatched sheets of tin. Outbuildings dotted the property: a sagging shed, a half-collapsed barn, and what looked like an old root cellar reinforced with stone. From the outside, it was the kind of place no one would glance at twice, but to detectives, every detail was a potential hiding place. Mercer lived alone. He drove an aging pickup, bought groceries in town once a week, and spent long stretches of time tinkering in his yard or disappearing into the woods with tools slung over his shoulder. Agents noted the way he worked with blades and saws, sharpening them meticulously, as though tools were more companions than objects. Once, under cover of night, investigators crept close enough to photograph the interior of his shed through a cracked plank. What they saw unsettled them. Hooks lined the walls, holding ropes, tarps, and coils of wire. On the workbench sat chisels and knives with blades dulled from heavy use. Hanging on a nail was a pair of gloves stained dark at the fingertips. These observations built probable cause. The prosecutor agreed. They had enough to request a warrant. The plan was to execute it swiftly, before Mercer suspected he was being watched. The raid was scheduled for dawn. Tactical officers gathered in the pre-dawn chill, their breath fogging in the headlights of unmarked vehicles. The air was taut with anticipation, the kind that comes when everyone knows the balance between routine arrest and explosive danger is impossibly thin. As the convoy turned onto Mercer's road, tires crunching gravel, the forest loomed in silence. The cabin appeared slowly through the mist, a squat silhouette against the rising light. Officers moved fast, fanning out to secure the perimeter. A battering ram slammed the door, and the cabin shuddered as it burst inward. Inside, Eli Mercer stood frozen in the dim light of a single lantern. He didn't resist. Officers swarmed, pinning him to the floor, securing his wrists in steel. He muttered no protest, no plea. His eyes flicked around the room, not in panic, but as if he were calculating something, committing every detail to memory before it was lost. With Mercer removed, forensic teams began their work. The cabin was cramped and cluttered, its air heavy with the scent of damp wood and diesel. Piles of tools covered every surface, some rusted, others gleaming from recent sharpening. A cot lay in the corner, its blankets unwashed, its floor littered with sawdust and shavings. Investigators cataloged everything. They scraped the blades, bagged the gloves, photographed the coils of rope. They noticed patterns, tarps folded with military precision, jars filled with soil samples labeled with dates, as if Mercer had been conducting experiments. The search extended to the shed. Here, the atmosphere turned darker. The walls bore deep gouges, some horizontal, some vertical, as though someone had practiced cutting into wood again and again. In the corner sat rolls of heavy black tarp, the same kind traced to the cedar cavity. Nearby, a plastic container held traces of fertilizer pellets and the faint smell of diesel. It was as if the forensic lab's findings had been recreated in real life, waiting quietly in the shadows of his property. But it was what lay beneath the floorboards that chilled investigators most. One officer noticed the boards near the center of the shed were uneven, their nails newer than the rest. When pried up, the gap revealed a crawl space dug directly into the earth. The air that wafted out was cold, stale, tinged with the unmistakable odor of decay. Flashlights pierced the darkness. At first, only dirt and debris appeared. Then, half buried in the soil, a scrap of fabric. It was pale, weathered, and clung to the earth as though it had been there for years. When lifted, the fragment revealed stitching consistent with hiking gear. Forensic specialists carefully excavated the surrounding soil, uncovering more, a rusted zipper, the frame of a small pack, and beneath it, what appeared to be the delicate curve of bone. The discovery froze the room into silence. The possibility they had feared, that Emma had not been Mercer's only victim, was taking shape beneath their feet. The excavation was methodical, each scoop of earth sifted and bagged. They uncovered, not one, but several bone fragments. Age and condition made immediate identification impossible, but the implications were undeniable. Mercer's shed was not just a workshop. It was a burial site. Back at the cabin, detectives confronted Mercer. He sat in a chair, wrists cuffed, staring at the wall. They told him what they had found. His jaw tightened, but his eyes betrayed no surprise. He had lived with this secret for years, and the look on his face seemed to say he knew this day would eventually come. The raid stretched into hours. Forensic teams combed every inch of the property, hauling away crates of tools, soil samples, and personal effects. In the root cellar, beneath jars of preserved vegetables, they found clothing scraps stuffed into a rusted tin box. A shirt sleeve, a shoelace, buttons from a jacket. Some matched items described in reports of missing hikers from years past. Others were unaccounted for. By nightfall, the property resembled an excavation site more than a homestead. Floodlights illuminated the cabin. Tents shielded evidence stations, and officers rotated shifts cataloging every item. The sense of discovery mixed with dread. Because while the cedar tree had given them Emma, Mercer's property suggested something far worse, that she may not have been alone. For the Lane family, news of the raid was delivered carefully. Officials told Mary only that evidence had been recovered, that a suspect was in custody, that her daughter's case was closer to resolution. But reporters caught wind of the operation. Soon headlines blared. Suspect arrested in hollow tree murder. Investigators find more remains. The story spiraled across the state, and with it came fear. Parents pulled their children from camping trips. Hikers canceled reservations. The wilderness, once a place of wonder, had become a backdrop for horror. And yet, even with Mercer in custody and evidence mounting, investigators knew the hardest truth was still ahead. They had found Emma's remains, and possibly others. But what they needed now was Mercer's voice, his account of what happened in those woods and why. Until he spoke, the tree was only part of the story. The interrogation room was small, bare, and sterile. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting sharp shadows against white walls. Eli Mercer sat at the table, hands cuffed, his wiry frame hunched forward as though trying to fold in on itself. His face betrayed little, a lined, weathered mask hardened by years of solitude. The only movement came from his eyes, shifting between the detectives across from him and the recording device, blinking red at the edge of the table. For hours after the raid, Mercer had said almost nothing. When officers first dragged him from his cabin, he neither fought nor begged. He offered no protest when they read him his rights. He simply stared at the forest as they led him away, his gaze fixed as if he were saying goodbye to something only he could see. Now, in the confines of the interview room, detectives began their slow, methodical pressure. They laid out photographs: Emma's shoes from the hollow cedar, the fabric and bones from beneath the shed, the rolls of tarp identical to those used in the concealment. Mercer glanced at each photo but said nothing. His silence wasn't defiance. Exactly. More like calculation, as though he were weighing whether words had any value left. The lead detective leaned forward. Eli, we know you were working in the sector where Emma disappeared. We know you left your job days after the search began. We found the tools, the tarps, the soil. This is your chance to explain what happened. For a long time, the only sound was the hum of the light. Then Mercer exhaled, a slow, deliberate breath. I didn't kill her, he said at last. His voice was rough, low, but steady. I found her. Detectives exchanged glances. It was the kind of half-confession they had expected, the attempt to admit involvement without admitting guilt. Mercer leaned back, his cuffs clinking against the table. She was already hurt when I saw her. She'd gone off the trail, down by the cedars. She was lying there, barely moving. I thought she'd fallen. I didn't know what else to do. I carried her to the tree. I thought maybe I could keep her safe until I figured something out. The detectives let the words hang, giving him space. Silence was a powerful tool. People often filled it with the truths they tried to bury. But Mercer stopped there, folding his lips tight again. The detective tapped the photo of the shoes. You stuffed her inside that cedar. You carved it out. You packed moss to hide her. That's not what someone does when they're trying to help. That's what someone does when they're trying to bury the evidence. Mercer's jaw tightened. You don't understand. Nobody came looking. The woods take people all the time. I thought. He trailed off, his gaze dropping. To the table, detectives pressed harder. They reminded him of the remains under his shed. They pointed out the fertilizer and diesel traced to his property, the chisels matching the gouges inside the tree. Piece by piece, they laid the puzzle before him, each fragment a nail tightening the box around his denials. Finally, Mercer's composure cracked. His voice rose, ragged, defensive. She shouldn't have been alone. I saw her walking, all by herself, not a sound around her. I called out. She looked back, but she kept moving. I followed. I just wanted to see where she was going. Then she slipped. She fell near the grove. By the time I reached her, she wasn't speaking anymore. She was fading. I thought. He stopped, his eyes darting, searching for an explanation even he could believe. You thought what? The detective asked. Mercer's shoulders sagged. His voice dropped to a whisper. I thought nobody would believe me. It was the same refrain investigators had heard in countless cases. The insistence of accident, the claim of panic. But nothing in the evidence supported it. The clean shoes, the carved tree, the packed moss, all pointed to deliberate concealment. not desperate improvisation. Detectives pushed further. You didn't just panic. You planned. You had the tools, the chemicals, the tarps. This wasn't the first time, was it? Mercer's silence returned, heavier now, his gaze fixed on the wall. Minutes ticked by. Then, almost inaudibly, he said, "The forest keeps secrets. Always has." It was not a confession in words, but in weight. Investigators knew it. Behind that sentence lay truths too dark to name, too tangled in his solitude to ever be drawn out fully. But they pressed anyway. When confronted about the bones under his shed, Mercer shifted his story again. He claimed they were old, not his doing. "That ground was like that when I moved in," he muttered. But when detectives pointed out that the soil samples matched the very chemicals he used, he faltered. His voice grew sharper, more erratic, swinging between denial and half-admission. Finally, in a burst of frustration, he blurted the words that chilled the room. "She wasn't the only one." The detectives froze. "What do you mean?" Mercer's eyes flicked up, catching theirs for the first time. A hollow smile tugged at his lips. "You think one girl makes a forest hungry? No. There are others. Always others." But when pressed to name them, he clammed up again, retreating into silence so profound it seemed impenetrable. The detectives tried every tactic. Coaxing, anger, empathy, but Mercer would not elaborate. He had given them a glimpse, nothing more. By the end of the session, they had enough to secure charges: concealment of a body, tampering with evidence, homicide. His shifting stories, his admission of finding Emma, his acknowledgement of others, all would weigh against him. But the full truth of his actions remained buried, half swallowed by the same silence that had shrouded Emma for years. For the Lane family, the news of the confession brought no comfort. Mary listened as investigators recounted Mercer's words. That he claimed Emma had already been hurt. That he only wanted to hide her. That there might be others. She pressed her palms to her eyes, tears leaking through her fingers. "He's lying," she said, her voice hoarse. "He's lying because he doesn't want us to know what he really did." Detectives agreed. Mercer's confession was not the truth. It was a carefully constructed mask, a blend of fact and fiction meant to blur the line between accident and intent. But within that mask lay enough detail to condemn him. Still, the haunting question remained: how many truths had he left unspoken? The trial of Eli Mercer was brief, but the echoes of his crimes would stretch far beyond the courthouse. He was charged with homicide, abuse of a corpse, and obstruction of justice. Prosecutors debated pursuing additional charges tied to the remains under his shed, but without definitive identification, those counts remained in limbo. Instead, they focused on the case they could prove beyond question: the disappearance and concealment of Emma Lane. In court, Mercer was quiet. He sat in an ill-fitting suit, his wiry frame swallowed by fabric, his hands folded neatly on the defense table. He rarely looked up. When photographs of the hollow tree and Emma's shoes were shown to the jury, he lowered his gaze to the floor, as though refusing to meet the eyes of the world. The prosecution laid out their case methodically. They displayed the blade gouges. Inside the cedar, the moss fibers shoved unnaturally deep. The diesel and fertilizer traced back to Mercer's property. They showed the chisels from his shed, the rolls of black tarp, the soil samples that matched perfectly with the cavity where Emma's remains had been found. Piece by piece, the puzzle was assembled until no juror could doubt that Mercer had deliberately concealed her. The defense attempted to maintain his story of accident. They claimed Emma had already been dying when Mercer found her, that he had panicked and hidden her out of fear. But the jury was unconvinced. Panic might explain poor decisions, but it didn't explain carving into a tree with a blade, stuffing moss to hide evidence, or burying other remains under a shed. It didn't explain silence maintained for 4 years. When the verdict came guilty on all counts, Mercer showed no reaction. He stared straight ahead, his expression blank, as though the outcome had been written long ago. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the Lane family, the trial offered closure, but not peace. Mary Lane sat in the front row each day, clutching Emma's photo in her hands. When the verdict was read, she wept quietly, her tears sliding down her face as she whispered, "For Emma." Later, outside the courthouse, she told reporters, "I wanted to know what happened to my daughter. Now I do." But knowing doesn't take away the ache. It doesn't take away the years. David Lane, quieter than his mother, spoke only once during the proceedings. In his victim impact statement, he stood at the podium and looked directly at Mercer. His voice was steady, but his hands shook as he gripped the paper. "You took my sister. You tried to hide her like she was nothing. But she wasn't nothing. She was everything. And even if you never say another word, even if you take the truth of what you did with you, you'll never erase her from this world." You failed at that. The courtroom was silent. Even the judge paused before continuing, her voice heavy with gravity as she delivered the sentence. Yet even as the family left the courthouse with some measure of resolution, investigators knew the case was not over, because Mercer's words still lingered. She wasn't the only one. Those 5 words spoken in the sterile interrogation room hung like a shadow over the entire case. They could have been taunting, a way to maintain control in a situation where he had lost everything. But the evidence from his property suggested otherwise. The bones under his shed were real. The clothing scraps were real. The belongings that didn't match Emma's, a button, a shoelace, fragments of fabric, were real. The Lane family was not alone in their grief. There were likely others. Families who had spent years searching, who had never found their answers. The sheriff's department quietly reopened old case files of missing persons in and around Olympic National Park. Hikers who had disappeared in the 1990s. A logger who never returned from a shift. A transient whose camp was found abandoned years before Emma vanished. Names that had once gathered dust now resurfaced, pinned once again to investigation boards with strings of red connecting them to Mercer's cabin. But proving those connections would be nearly impossible. Time had erased too much. Bones without. Names are like whispers without voices, evidence that something happened, but not enough to say who or why. Still, the fear remained. In the small towns bordering the park, people spoke of Mercer with unease, as though even locked behind bars, his presence lingered. Parents warned their children about the woods. Hikers second-guessed trips into the backcountry. The hollow cedar, where Emma had been found, became a place of dread, a landmark not marked on maps but whispered about in hushed tones. For rangers, the discovery changed everything. No longer was the forest just a place of accidents and lost trails. It had become a stage where human darkness could hide beneath the canopy. Rangers began to patrol differently, their eyes sharper, their ears tuned not just for the cries of lost hikers, but for the subtle signs of someone who didn't belong. And for Mary Lane, life would never return to what it had been. She carried the weight of knowing Emma had been found, but also the heavier weight of knowing she had been hidden. That someone had made the choice to carve into a living tree, to stuff her daughter's body into its hollow, to walk away and live with that secret. She often returned to the park, standing at the edge of the grove where Emma's scent had last been traced years before. She would close her eyes and listen to the wind in the branches, the call of birds overhead, the rustle of leaves. To others, it was nature's music. To her, it was a reminder that the forest had once concealed her daughter's final resting place. Emma Lane's story became part of Olympic's dark folklore. Visitors asked about her. Guides told her story cautiously, and her name appeared in documentaries about the dangers of the wilderness. But to those who knew the truth, it was never just a wilderness story. It was a story of a predator who had lived among them, hidden in plain sight, using the forest as cover. Eli Mercer would die in prison. That much was certain. But the question of how many secrets he had buried in the woods would likely never be answered. And so, though Emma's case was officially closed, the shadow of Mercer's words remained. She wasn't the only one.